Good afternoon. As Sultana said, my name is Diana Elliott, and I manage Pew's Financial Security and Mobility Research. Thank you all so much for joining this webinar. In a previous study, Pew showed that neighborhood poverty is associated with downward mobility, reinforcing other research linking high poverty neighborhoods with more unemployment, poorer performing schools, and increased violence, all of which pose risks to residents' financial security. Today, I'm sharing findings from our recently released chart book, Neighborhood Poverty and Household Financial Security, underscoring that family finances vary greatly between high and low poverty communities across the United States, and that neighborhood poverty influences people's attitudes toward their own finances. These data are from the Survey of American Family Finances, commissioned by Pew in November 2014. How do we define neighborhood poverty? Neighborhood poverty was measured using 2009 to 2013 5-year estimates from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. Low poverty neighborhoods are defined here as having 5% or less of residents in poverty. Medium poverty neighborhoods are those where between 5 and 25% of residents live in poverty. High poverty neighborhoods are those where 25% or more of residents are in poverty. Key findings include: not all residents of high poverty neighborhoods are low income. 1/3 of those living in high poverty neighborhoods are middle or upper income. Families living in low poverty neighborhoods are more financially stable, more often owning their own homes and having checking and education savings accounts than families in high poverty neighborhoods. Low-income residents in low poverty neighborhoods are more financially secure than those living in high poverty communities. For example, low-income households in high poverty neighborhoods have almost no wealth, while similar families in low poverty communities have at least some accumulated wealth. And regardless of income, neighborhood poverty matters for financial security. Even when holding constant income, net worth, home ownership, and demographic characteristics, families in high poverty neighborhoods rate their financial situations lower than those in more prosperous communities. Let's explore these findings in detail. When we talk about high and low poverty neighborhoods, it's important to keep in mind that these communities have income diversity. Although most residents of high poverty neighborhoods are in the bottom tier of the income distribution, 1/4 are in the middle, and 1 in 10 are in the top tier. Similarly, fewer than half of residents in low poverty neighborhoods are top earners, but more than 1/3 are in the middle and about 1/5 are in the bottom income tier. The financial stability of residents of low poverty neighborhoods tends to be greater than that of those living in high poverty neighborhoods. Residents of high poverty areas are more likely to have unstable economic situations, earnings that are equal to or lower than expenses, and difficulty meeting basic financial obligations such as mortgage, rent, or bills. Those living in low poverty neighborhoods are more likely to be homeowners and to have a mortgage on their primary residence, and tend to be more equipped with practical financial products such as checking accounts, credit cards, or college savings accounts. The typical household in a low poverty neighborhood has 40 times higher net worth than one in a high poverty neighborhood. But families in the same income categories tend to have very different net worth levels depending on the neighborhood in which they live. For example, low-income households in high poverty neighborhoods have only $800 in accumulated wealth, compared with $35,000 for those in low poverty communities. Homeownership does not explain this pronounced difference in net worth, which holds true regardless of home equity. Looking at housing in greater detail, residents of low poverty neighborhoods are almost twice as likely to own a home as those in communities with high poverty. Median home values are also greater in low poverty neighborhoods. Following the Great Recession, housing prices declined in all neighborhood types, while homeownership rates remained relatively stable. Although home values fell 14% in both neighborhood types, low poverty neighborhoods experienced a greater decline in real dollars, about $42,000 compared with about $14,000 in high poverty neighborhoods. Nevertheless, home prices remained much higher in low poverty neighborhoods, suggesting that homeowners maintained more equity. Residents of low poverty neighborhoods are more likely to have savings and more total savings than those in high poverty neighborhoods. The savings discrepancy is especially notable among low-income households. 59% of low-income families living in low-poverty neighborhoods have money they consider to be savings, and 54% have at least $1,000 in liquid assets, compared with just 35% and 28% respectively among low-income residents living in high-poverty areas. Even when controlling for income, net worth, homeownership, and factors like age and race, families living in high-poverty communities have lower savings than those living in low-poverty neighborhoods. We know that families' financial reality differs by neighborhood poverty, but how do perceptions vary? Overall, households in high and low poverty neighborhoods rate the country's economy similarly, but those in the bottom and middle income tiers are more likely to perceive the country's economy as good or excellent if they live in a high poverty rather than a low poverty neighborhood. Residents of low poverty neighborhoods across all income levels are more optimistic about their own financial situations than those in high poverty communities. They more often rate their as good or excellent and report feeling more financially secure than those living in high poverty neighborhoods. Even when holding constant income, net worth, homeownership, race, age, and other factors, families in high poverty neighborhoods rate their own financial situations lower than those in low and medium poverty communities. Nearly 6 in 10 households in low poverty neighborhoods say their own financial situations are good or excellent, while just 48% of families in high poverty neighborhoods say the same. In conclusion, these findings show that high poverty neighborhoods, while not exclusively composed of low-income households, are characterized by greater financial instability than more prosperous areas. Remarkably, these findings hold true even after controlling for income, net worth, age, and race. The neighborhoods in which families live matter for their sense of financial security above and beyond the money they make or the savings they hold. American families' local surroundings are critical for their financial security. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Diana. And again, if you have questions during the presentation, please do enter those into the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll now turn it over to Solana Rice with the Corporation for Enterprise Development.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Sounds like we're getting just a little bit of feedback. So for those who do not know the Corporation for Enterprise Development, we're a national organization based in DC, and we've been doing work to expand financial capability and security for over 30 years now. So on the next slide, you see a quick overview of who CFED is. We identify good ideas, develop partnerships, and ideally bring them to scale. And so in short, the core value of CFED is working with partners on the front lines and engaging them to build financial security through public policy, through research, and through really capacity building through a lot of nonprofit organizations across the country. On the next slide, we'll see just a quick snapshot of all of the resources that I will share with you today. They can all be accessed at assetsandopportunity.org. First, we have the Assets and Opportunity Scorecard, the local data center, and the Assets and Opportunity Network, where you can connect to nearly 100 leaders across the country focused on financial security. And so I raise all these just to show that there are a lot of data sources, including some of the data that you just heard from Pew. And what I'm so excited to present today is not only what these data sources are, but how people really put them to use, because it's one thing to have the numbers, it's another thing to be able to use and leverage those numbers to advance your policy or programmatic priorities. So I'll start with a few words about the Assets and Opportunities Scorecard on the next slide. And since it's our long-standing hallmark data product, I'll just give you a quick overview. The scorecard is an annual snapshot of financial security across all 50 states and DC. We examine 61 outcome measures and 69 policies that span 5 topic areas: financial assets and income, business and jobs, housing and home ownership, education, and healthcare. And so we have many, many policies and measures within each of those buckets. And just in line with some of the research that Pew has found, that this year some of our findings find that show that despite claims of economic recovery, that still too many Americans are still climbing the steep hill to financial security. We present this data in large part to shape the conversation about the many elements to building financial security and the fact that policy has a big hand in shaping that reality for families. When we present the scorecard, we find that many of our members use it for strategic planning and for research. Half of our membership in our Assets and Opportunity Network use it to do fundraising and writing narratives for grant proposals, and 40% use it to educate policymakers. So we're seeing really good uptake, and that's critical for this product. It's only as good as much as people are using it in their real work and in their real lives. So on the next slide, I'll go over a little bit more about some of the local data that we're seeing. So over the last 2 years, we have added data about cities and counties to answer the call from our network about having local data to inform their work. So thanks to the generous support of City Community Development, we have been able to estimate 4 indicators of financial security that were previously unavailable. And this is a resource for every city and county, nearly every city and county in the U.S. Those indicators are asset poverty, not having much net worth; liquid asset poverty, not having 3 months of savings to live above the poverty level should you lose your income; unbanked rates, not having savings or a checking account; and underbanked rates, which is having an account but still depending on alternative financial products. These are all data points that help give context to the insecurity and the fragility of household financial well-being. But they don't tell us why these numbers look the way they do, and they don't tell us what to do to improve these numbers. So that's why on the next slide, we've worked with City Community Development and our partners in the Assets and Opportunity Network to host an initiative called Family Assets Count, and it focuses on not only bringing that new data, but bringing that new data to 10 cities in particular in order to build stronger coalitions and partnerships among our nonprofit partners, and also to catalyze and advance policy and program solutions among mayors. And so as I mentioned, we've been doing this over the last 2 years, and in short, the data has been powerful for these groups. So in each of the 10 cities, we have created in-depth data profiles, 2 of which you see featured here on the screen. I have to say, they're really an excuse to gather people together on an issue. We use the profiles as an organizing tool to help coalitions and groups clarify their targeted outcomes. What are we really trying to accomplish together? And so in each of the cities, we spent several meetings with our network leaders reviewing the data, understanding the data, starting to identify priorities and determining how those groups wanted to interpret the information, and also developing a policy agenda and principles for financial security in their cities. We also use this data to inform funders in several of the cities and hosted funder briefings just for some of the philanthropic leaders in these places. So After a few regular meetings, we also started to engage the mayors in these communities, in these cities, and their staff, the mayor's staff, to identify opportunities to either use the data in upcoming announcements, use the principles to help shape policies and policy recommendations, and to encourage collaboration with other electeds, quite honestly. Here you see a photo of Mayor Walsh in Boston speaking not only about the data featured in Family Assets Count, but also announcing a new Office of Financial Empowerment and a new Financial Opportunity Center in a neighborhood. So this really can have an influence, and we're continually seeing Mayor Walsh's leadership in particular on this issue. Finally, in almost all of the cities, we use this process to do some sort of public event. So as I mentioned, this was a press conference with the mayor, but we also hosted gatherings of coalition partners, mostly to release the data, to continue that conversation, and to raise public awareness. And so each of the 10 cities, we've also paired this work with media outreach and media attention. So I do think that again, the data and the numbers are so valuable and useful, but only when you're able to tell the story and tell the so what and what will we do about it implications of those data points. On the last slide, I'll just leave you with a few resources. We have a walkthrough of our Assets and Opportunities Scorecard, so if you're curious about how to use that and how other groups use it, we just had a webinar actually yesterday, so check out that recording. Please join the Assets and Opportunity Network to stay up to date on new data releases and new ideas on how to use the products that we're putting out. And also you can absolutely learn more and see us all face-to-face at the Assets Learning Conference in DC, September 28th through 30th. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Solana. That sounds like an excellent opportunity, and we appreciate you sharing those tools and resources to promote change at the local level. For those of you that have questions for Solana, please do enter them into the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'd like to now hand off to Bryan Collier with the Foundation for the Carolinas.
Good afternoon. Hi, this is Bryan Collier, and I have the honor of serving as Executive Vice President at Foundation for the Carolinas in Charlotte, North Carolina. There are about 800 community foundations across the country, and ours serves the greater Charlotte, Mecklenburg area. About 2 million people within our area. I've been asked today to talk about a way that we have taken some national data, primarily around Roz Chetty's research, but also work that Pew has done, to bring some of these neighborhood issues to light, especially when some damaging information comes to light in your community. And what I'm going to talk about specifically today is the creation of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Opportunity Task Force. The task force actually emerged from about a year's worth of work that we had done prior to launching the task force last year, May of 2015, when we received some Chetty data and also bringing in Aaron Courier from Pew and Richard Reeves from Brookings and others to really talk to us about the impact of this issue in the community. Next slide. So where did all of this come about? As most of you know, when Roz Chetty and Harvard and Cal Berkeley did their research around how likely it is that a child born into the lowest quintile, in other words, into a high degree of poverty, how likely is it that child would be able to move out of that? And in the case of this study, how likely is it that they would move from the lowest quintile to the upper quintile? When they looked at 50 communities across the country, the 50 largest cities, Charlotte ranked 50th of 50. And it was a shock to the system here in this community. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Charlotte, but it sort of has this New South mentality where it believes it's a place of opportunity. You move here, you move from New York or Chicago, you get a bigger house, you have more opportunity, it's a great place to live, things like that. And when this kind of information came out, it was a shock to the system where we started trying to figure out, A, is the information correct? Because the way the study was done, it took children who were born in the early 80s and then moved them forward into the late 2010, 2012. So firstly, we needed to figure out Was the data an accurate portrait of what's going on in this community? And if so, what would we do about this? And as you can see from the map that we use consistently here in Charlotte, the CFED data actually sort of is an indictment of the Southeast as a whole, but then within the Southeast, Charlotte ranked at the bottom. And as some of the data has actually pointed out, Charlotte ranked worse on mobility than any other developed country. So not just a community in the United States, but actually a developed country. So again, we were trying to figure out what to do with this, and we started pulling apart the data. Next slide. So one of the things that we started looking at was all right, let's create a task force that we can put together and use this task force to go deep into these issues. So we started thinking about, first and foremost, what we talked to the community about was this is not a short-term situation. We do not want a task force that's going to come back to the community with report in about a month or 2 months or 3 months. In fact, what we told the community was this would be at least an 18-month process. And we also were very deliberate about creating a diverse task force that had a mix of by race, by gender, by age, by sexual orientation, by industry group, by income level to some degree. Every way that we could figure out how to create a diverse group, we tried to put that into a 20-person committee. Obviously, you can't do that you can't segregate or you can't slice and dice a community every which way, but we tried as best as possible. Next slide. So when we look at the CFED data, the 5 predictors that emerge from that, and the ones that we decided to really focus on are these 5 predictors, not causal. We don't know if they're causally related, but we know that they're predictors. So segregation by race and income, reflected again in the Pew study that we heard about earlier today. Income inequality, school quality, social capital, the degree of connectedness and networks and things like that. And then family structure, meaning single-parent households, teenage pregnancy rates, unintended pregnancies, all of those things. Next slide. So I'm not going to go through all of the slides. If you're interested, at the end of this presentation, you'll see a link to the website where you can get a lot of the data that we have unearthed. But one of the first things that we tried to do was we tried to say, if we look at each of these elements and these predictors, what is the story telling us? If you can see this is just one slide. We have a lot of different slices of the demographics of our community. As you can see from this particular slide, we are a highly, highly segregated community, both by race and not reflected in this one, but in others, by income. And so if you look on this one, the blue is white families. Each dot represents 10 families, or 10 people. And then the green, what looks like green, is actually a yellow and green mixed together, are Asian, Latino, and African-American families. And what it told us instantly was this highly segregated nature of our community, and the fact that then flows through a lot of the other predictors and things that we're looking at, including school quality, homeless, quality of affordable housing, all of those things. Next slide. So again, what we tried to do was respond together as a task force. Next slide, please. One of the things that the task force started doing was thinking, okay, how do we look at all of these swirling issues that impact the life of a child, of a young adult, of an adult who's transitioning into the workforce? And one of the ways that we have tried to do that is to look at this as concentric rings that surround an individual in the middle. We haven't yet identified what that individual is. In other words, we're still working through the process of saying who is our intended target for this initiative when it emerges, and then from there, what are the interventions that we might put in place. But some of the things that we've tried to explore are these rings that surround the individual in the middle. And I always talk about the rings being systems and structures, and you can see there how we've defined that. The community that supports the individual, and the family, and that's direct, however that's defined, as a caregiver, direct parents, others, and then the individual in the middle. One thing I've tried to be clear with everyone is if I can create a utopia in Charlotte where we've solved all of those other issues, meaning systems, community, and family, we still have to work on the individual in the middle so that they understand the sense of hope, aspirations, grit, resilience. They feel a sense of connectedness. So we can't forget that that individual in the middle needs to be supported and inspired as well. And if we've created all these systems changes, it is our expectation that the individual in the middle will then be able to take advantage of that for their own social and upward mobility. And I show you this as just one slide to give you an example of what the task force is looking at. And each one of these elements, the task force is looking at in session. So they started meeting last May. They meet every 3 weeks, every third Thursday for about 3 hours, and then a bunch of other learnings and lessons along the way. But they go through each of these topics and others along the way. So again, they've been meeting just short of a year. An incredible group of people who have been very dedicated to looking at this issue and really being thoughtful and deliberate about how we respond. Next slide, please. So just quickly, some of the successes and challenges that we've had so far in our first year of working on this. It has been a great public-private partnership. So the City of Charlotte, the County of Mecklenburg, a number of other major foundations are on board with us, and everyone has sort of given us patience to be thoughtful about this. And others have started to implement changes as they've seen recommendations or concepts emerge that feel like they would be an ultimate recommendation of the task force. And so we've already seen the city and county starting to think about in a more deliberate way the way that they start to intervene in this issue. We've been able to bring national and local research. I mentioned we brought Bryan Collier from Pew here, Richard Reeves from Brookings, Robert Putnam has been here, people from Baltimore, New York, we've tried to also bring what most people would think of more progressive think tank, like a Brookings or Center to Progressive, and combine that with more conservative. So American Enterprise Institute, Manhattan Institute, places like that have also come to the city to talk about this issue from their perspective. I mentioned this idea of a diverse task force that we've been very intentional about. There are very few places you can go in Charlotte where people don't know this idea of economic opportunity, where you can have a conversation at dinner parties and people can talk about this. We've certainly created a rich dialogue. We've had a number of listening sessions where people are being very candid about their own paths in life and who helped them or who didn't, or what systems may have interfered with their trajectory. And on the challenges side, the task force selection was incredibly painful to make it as diverse as we wanted to make it, to have the city and the county wanting individual representation and people on there, to have foundations who wanted representation, the business sector, the faith sector. All of that was an incredibly painful process. It took about 3 months to nail it down. But in the end, I think we have certainly done as good a job as we could expect to do. I put in quote should have been little p, but politics. While we've been going along with the task force, we've got a national debate swirling around opportunity. We've got local issues around school reassignment within our school system. We've got, as you can imagine from the map, highly segregated schools. So there's a conversation going around, how do we break up these high concentrations of poverty? And then what are the impacts of that to affluent areas? Again, this issue, the next one is, who are we targeting? We still haven't determined what that is. We're starting to develop a list of indicators that we believe will lead us in that direction, but we've been very thoughtful about not really defining who is the target yet. Community engagement has continued to be both a problem and an opportunity. Getting people to come out and talk, as you can imagine, is very difficult. We've tried a variety of ways, mostly by going into neighborhoods, using a variety of different techniques, using grassroots organizations to give us access to candid and thoughtful conversations. And then again, ultimately, we've got this issue around defining the long-term goal. Everyone has a view, everyone has an intended outcome, and we're trying to put all those together in a way that is sellable and marketable to the community as a whole, is something that everyone wants to get on board with. Next slide. So quickly, I just talk a little bit about engaging the community, and you can go to the next slide. So we've gone out into the community with a variety of activities, events, community listening. We've tried to do flip chart meetings, and we've tried to do microphone meetings where people get up and share. We have gone to grassroots organizations to let them bring in clients and talk, but not in a way where we're saying, tell us what it's like to be poor, tell us your challenges. Really in a way where we're getting them to be more candid and thoughtful about the way that they can communicate with us to tell us about their life's trajectory and how it either went one direction or another, and what we could have done or what this community as a whole could have done to help with that trajectory. We have, as you can see, I would encourage you to go to Opportunity SHAR-MEC. One of the things that we've tried to do is keep the community aware of what we're reading. So every week an email goes out to our task force saying, here's the big articles that we've seen, the New York Times, New Yorker, the Pew has come out with a new study, Brookings, AEI, whoever it is. Here's what we're reading, here's what we're seeing, we want you to be up to date on this. Here's what the newspaper is talking about, our local paper. Facebook and Twitter have certainly been very active for us. And then we've tried to tell everyone, share what you've learned today. Take this information and go out and have a small dinner, have a cocktail party, whatever it is. And we've given them materials that they can go in, sort of opportunity in a box kind of materials where they can have a conversation with individuals to talk about, especially in our affluent areas, how did you get where you are, and how do we dissuade you of this notion that you did it on your own, and how did the community support you, and then what's missing in other areas. And the other thing is, how do we go towards a community that sort of reflects Robert Putnam's theme of his new book, Our Kids. It's not my kids, it's not your kids, it's our kids, and how do we move that forward? So I appreciate the opportunity to talk today. Happy to answer questions, and would be more than thrilled to talk to any of you individually about the things that we've learned here in Charlotte, which we have a long way to go on.
Thank you, Bryan. We appreciate you sharing about these boots-on-the-ground effort of the Opportunity Task Force in Charlotte to move the needle on opportunity and social mobility. So this may have inspired some questions from our listeners. Please do go ahead and enter those questions into the questions box. I promise you we will get to those at the end. Now we are going to move from the East Coast of the United States over to the West Coast, and we will be hearing from Carrie Sheehawk with the King County Executive's Office.
Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be talking to you all, and glad I have the benefit of coming at the end of the presenters to benefit from all of their good thoughts. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking to you about how King County has taken data like that in the Pew Chart book and put it to innovative use. I work for the King County Executive's Office. King County is the 13th largest county in the country. We're in Washington State, and our county includes Seattle and 38 cities. And the county executive is an elected position, elected countywide. So let's look at the next slide. And what you see here are several maps that are very similar to those you see in the Pew Chart book. And these are maps that we put together about 5 years ago. In late 2013, King County and the San Francisco Federal Reserve convened about 200 community partners to really look at our region's troubling inequities that are really apparent on these maps. So the maps you see here are maps of the urban area of King County. Seattle's kind of in the center left of those maps, and they display a variety of health metrics: life expectancy, tobacco use, diabetes, mental distress, obesity. The red indicates health metrics that are relatively poor outcomes, and the blue indicate health metrics that are relatively good outcomes. And you can see that there are strikingly similar patterns across all of these health metrics. And there are strikingly startling rates of inequity in these health metrics that have very similar patterns by race and by place in King County. So these maps were really the focal point of that convening that we held with the San Francisco Federal Reserve and those 200 partners. And we really wanted to focus on what we could do about these inequities. Next slide. So at the same time that we're holding our convening, our community foundation, the Seattle Foundation, was also crafting a neighborhood initiative to address economic and racial inequities. And rather than each of us go it alone and craft separate initiatives, we decided to really join forces in an initiative that we call Communities of Opportunity. And we created a composite index of all of those metrics that you saw on the previous slide. And in that map on the slide here, that's our composite index, and you can see that those dark green areas are where we have relatively much to gain, as we like to say, in neighborhoods in South King County. So the goal of Communities of Opportunity is to really focus on those 20% of communities that have the most to gain, and to take a prevention-oriented approach and work at the intersection economic development and community cohesion. And if you go to the next slide, what I really want to impress upon you is that Communities of Opportunity is much more than another programmatic initiative. It's really a fundamental transformation in how government and philanthropy are working with communities. So under the kind of traditional approach, the old approach, we typically worked on silos. We work on one hot issue at a time. We try to spread resources evenly across our jurisdictions. Very typical for government or philanthropy to plan programs and then take them out and kind of lay them on top of the community. A lot of programs are focused on crisis intervention, like shelter as a response to homelessness. And often programs are implemented through doing RFPs every year, and program direction and priorities can change pretty frequently. In Communities of Opportunity, we're really focusing our investments in very specific communities, those 20% of communities that have the most to gain, and spending our time and our resource in those communities. We're working upstream and are really focusing on the root causes of disparities that require us to really work cross-sector. And we're recognizing that if we want to see big improvements in health and other social metrics, we have to work on many issues all at once. Government and philanthropy are working as conveners and enablers in a collective action approach. And we're bringing in other partners, leveraging other resources, and enabling and allowing the communities to set their own priorities and shape their own destiny. We're working both in places, but we're also attacking systemic, structural, and institutional racism and trying to break down the barriers in those concentric circles. And what's also very exciting is that rather than this being a sort of focused programmatic initiative that could change year by year, we're making a commitment to these communities to invest in them at least over 5 years. So let's look at the next slide, which is a graphic from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And I think it's just a really nice summary that is very similar to the approach that we're taking in Communities of Opportunity. It's really looking at all of the things that affect social outcomes and health. It's focused in particular places. It's taking that collective action approach, and it's working across many sectors. And through this approach, turning to the next slide, we've really been able to mobilize and empower the community. So this shows kind of a classic spectrum of community engagement. Many times government is down on the left in what we're doing. And through Communities of Opportunity, we're really pushing ourselves towards the right end of that spectrum to empower communities. And we've been pretty successful in that. What we're finding is that through this approach and really investing in the relationship building and listening to communities, what we're finding is that those communities' ambitions are much bigger than what we could have ever brought to the table on our own. So the next slide shows you the 3 initial communities that we are working in, Rainier Valley, White Center, and Tukwila. And it won't surprise you probably that there are some pretty common themes around what these communities want to work on. Basically, it's the basic components of what you all would recognize as thriving neighborhoods. We have a community partner in each of these sites who is acting as the backbone organization with us in designing and really engaging with the community. And we're just starting to have the specific interventions emerge. And I want to give you one example of that on the next slide. So what you see here is a draft rendering from our Rainier Valley site where the community is really interested in leveraging the opening of a light rail station, and they have a really fantastic vision for what this neighborhood could transform to, with a really vibrant community center. There's lots of interest in a shared commercial kitchen where many of our immigrant populations can come. We can do nutrition classes. People can start catering businesses. There's rooftop agriculture, classrooms, a town square marketplace, and a multicultural community center. Right now in this community, we have lots and lots of different ethnic community organizations who are all renting different spaces all around the community, and a central point of focus would really allow them to come together and explore lots of other connections. And I'm sure you can recognize this as the kind of place that you would like to live, and what we hope for is to really build those deep community connections so that as this area develops around transit, we keep people from being displaced. One of the big questions for the county has been how we sustain this kind of investment, and the next slide shows you the answer to that question. So the voters answered that question for us very resoundingly this past November with passage of a nearly $400 million property tax initiative that we call Best Starts for Kids. Best Starts for Kids is the most comprehensive approach to childhood development in the nation. It focuses half of the investment in very early childhood, but it also recognizes that there are some key developmental points in children's lives through age 24 and has investments and strategies in those age groups. And the key thing as well is that we know that our kids and our families can't be healthy unless the communities around them are really healthy. And so this property tax levy is going to allow us to sustain our investment in communities of opportunity to the tune of about $6 million a year, really letting us to invest in those communities, take it to scale, and have significant impact. And then kind of bringing our conversation here full circle, Best Starts for Kids also includes monies that are really going to allow us to do more robust data collection and evaluation so we can continue to improve and ensure that we're delivering the outcomes that we want for our communities.
Thank you, Carrie. We really appreciate you sharing about this bottom-up approach to drive resources to underinvested neighborhoods that can increase equity and positively influence policies, systems, and practices within and across these communities. We've now reached the questions and answers portion of our presentation, and our first question is for Solana. And I believe this is about the Assets and Opportunity Scorecard. There was a question about whether or not the asset data is going to be available by gender at the local level.
Hi, thank you for that question. Unfortunately, at this point, we don't have that data available by gender for every city and county. What we do have is in those 10 cities that we did an in-depth data profile, we do have some of that asset poverty data broken down by gender and by household composition. Specifically, the liquid asset poverty number is in the infographic section of those those reports, and you can find all of those at familyassetscount.org or at the local data center website.
Thank you. And the next question I'll direct to Bryan first, and then Carrie, and then after that, Solana, if you want to chime in. The question is, what kinds of individual and community engagement strategies have been found to improve the financial security of higher poverty neighborhoods?
So this is Bryan, and I think one of the things that we're currently looking at is not defining what we believe the interventions are at this moment. So I think I have my ideas about what those might be, but at our stage in the process, what we've been really clear with the community that we're going to start developing the indicators that we believe will move social and economic mobility, and then come back and backfill that then with the interventions that we believe will move us towards changing those indicators. So from our perspective right now, I have some ideas as a funder of what I believe might move those along, but I'd rather let the task force come out with those findings, by the way, which will be hopefully in late part of this year, so November timeframe when they come up with those recommendations.
This is Carrie. I would echo Bryan's comments. You know, the approach that we're really taking in King County is to really recognize our communities and members of those communities as the experts. People in these communities really understand that the difficulties they're facing, the barriers they're facing are multi-sectoral, they're multi-issue. They really understand what they need to improve their lives and what they need philanthropy and government to invest in. So the Seattle Foundation and King County are really working, very intentionally with these communities to empower them to design their own interventions, and those are going to vary across communities. A lot of the interventions that we're working on communities with, community interest has focused a lot around avoiding displacement and building the deep roots of ownership, business development, employment, housing in these communities, so that as we have more growth here in this region, folks don't get displaced and communities stay together.
Solana, did you want to comment on that question as well?
I'll just say that I totally agree with what Carrie and Bryan have offered, and that for CFED, many groups in our network are grappling with how to engage community and are starting to explore and experiment what it means to engage in community during tax time, specifically as we go into closer and closer to tax time and taxes being due. This is a really amazing opportunity for a lot of groups to work directly with families and to explore what it means to look through their financial issues and start to engage them in a conversation. But again, I absolutely agree with Bryan and Carrie that these solutions and interventions should be community-based and community-driven. That's the tax time issue is just one touch point that some of our groups are exploring.
Thank you. And a quick question for Bryan Collier. One of the listeners specifically asked about the name of the study which identified the social mobility of children born into poverty in the top 50 American cities.
Yep. So if you Google RAJ, R-A-J, Chetty, C-H-E-T-T-Y, you'll probably pop up with the study. But you can also go, I believe it's equalityofopportunity.org is where you'll find that study, plus a lot that have been done since the original study came out, which was, I think, late 2013. So you'll see a lot of studies that were done on this issue of mobility. You can also go, Pew has some great material. Richard Reeves at Brookings has a great video that you can watch if you just Google Richard Reeves Legos, like the Lego blocks. It's a 3-minute video that will explain this whole issue in 3 minutes. That is fantastic. And by the way, I wanted to take just 2 seconds to add something to the question that was just asked. And it may have seemed like a dodge, but one of the things that what we're really trying to think through is how do you avoid unintended consequences of potential solutions. So for instance, some programs that might be designed to improve financial stability, say even things like minimum wage, might have negative impacts towards a person's benefit eligibility. And here in North Carolina, I know other places, you have these benefit cliffs that can occur by adding $1 of wages or something like that to a person's life. You can have these dramatic impacts that we want to make sure we've explored all those before we come back with a solution.
Thank you, Bryan. And since we're running to the end of our time, we're just going to answer one final question. So this is for Bryan, and then if Carrie wants to chime in very quickly. First, the question was, how did the task force determine and measure the 5 opportunity predictors? And then I would just tag on to that very quickly. What advice would you give to other local efforts that are trying to start similar efforts that both you and Carrie are working on?
So my very quick advice would be don't do a task force, but we all know it's turned out to be wonderful. Task force are always challenging to administer and help with, and I say that as a joke. It's been wonderful, but in the beginning, it takes a lot of work, a lot of commitment. And by the way, we've told the community that this is a 30-year project. The task force will last 18 months, very short period of time up front. And so I would just think through that. And then what we have done is we've actually taken the Chetty data and then brought our own local research institution, the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, to help pull apart each of those data points to give us the relevant information at the very micro level. And in some things you have great indicators and you already have great information. Other places you're going to have to develop it, and other places you're going to have to find surrogates for the information. But I'm happy to talk to people offline. I know we're running short of time.
Thanks. Carrie?
Yeah, I just add you have to get started somewhere, and you need to go slow to go fast. Treat your people in your community as equal partners and leaders. Really invest in those relationships, and the solutions will emerge and they will stick. Just take the time to get out of your comfort zone and get into the community and invest in those relationships.
That's great advice. So as we close, we did have questions about whether or not the slides would be made available. We are going to look into efforts to try to make the slides available, but that will take time. Thank you again for joining us for the Addressing Neighborhood Poverty and Family Financial Security webinar. We hope that you found the information today interesting and informative. So we would also recommend that you take a minute to visit economicmobility.org, where you can find more research about these issues from the Pew Charitable Trust. And also, let's keep this conversation going on Twitter using the hashtag #PowerOfPlace. Thanks, and have a good afternoon.